For thousands of years, no one knew the Minoans had ever lived. Their cities lay buried beneath dirt and rock. Their stories were lost. Their language could not be read. The ancient Greeks spoke of a great king named Minos who ruled a powerful island. They told stories of a monster called the Minotaur, a creature that was half man and half bull, who lived deep inside a great maze. They called these stories myths. They called them legends, something invented, something not real. But the Greeks were wrong. In the year 1900, a British man named Arthur Evans began to dig into the soil of the island of Crete. Crete is a long, narrow island that sits in the eastern part of the sea, called the Mediterranean. It is located between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. It is a place where three great worlds meet. Evans had heard stories about this land. He had seen strange old stones and broken pieces of ancient pottery. He believed something important was buried beneath the ground, something big, something the world had forgotten. What he found would change history forever. Beneath the earth of Crete, Evans discovered a massive palace. It had more than 1,000 rooms. It had wide staircases going up and going down. It had long hallways that twisted and turned in every direction, like a maze. It had paintings on the walls that were still bright and full of color after thousands of years. These paintings showed dolphins jumping through ocean waves. They showed people leaping over the backs of great bulls. They showed women in fine clothes sitting in gardens. This palace had pipes in the ground for carrying clean water inside the building and for taking dirty water out. It had drains and water closets. This was not the home of a fairy tale. This was the home of a real and remarkable person. Evans called this place Knossos, and the people who built it he named the Minoans, after the legendary king Minos from the old Greek stories. The Minoans did not call themselves by that name. We do not know what they called themselves. We cannot read their writing, which is known as Linear A. It is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in all of human history. The Minoans left behind thousands of clay tablets covered in small signs and symbols. But no scholar, no codebreaker, no scientist in the world today has been able to decode those symbols. Every secret of who they truly were, what they believed in their hearts, what they prayed for, what they feared, is still locked inside a language that has no known key. What we do know is this. The Minoan civilization began to grow around 3,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. That means they lived more than 5,000 years ago. They were among the very first people in all of Europe to build large, organized cities. They were among the very first people in Europe to create a system of writing. They built roads and harbors and great stone buildings. They were, in every true sense of the words, the first great civilization that Europe ever produced. But the story of the Minoans does not begin on Crete alone. Before the great palaces rose from the earth, before the wide roads were built and the ships set sail, there were people living simple lives on the hills and valleys of Crete. Scientists have studied the bones of ancient Minoans and looked deep into their DNA, the biological code inside every human body that carries the story of where a person comes from. What they found was a people with deep roots in the ancient farming communities of the Near East. People who had crossed the sea from the lands near what we now call Turkey and the Middle East. Over many long centuries, these people settled on Crete. They mixed with others. They learned new ways. And slowly, generation by generation, they became something new. They became the Minoans. Crete was the perfect home for growing people. The island had thick forests full of timber for building ships. It had rich, dark soil perfect for growing grain, olives, and grapes. It had a long and winding coastline full of natural harbors where boats could anchor and where trade could take place in safety. It had high mountains at its center that made it hard for any enemy army to march across the island. And most important of all, Crete sat right in the middle of the ancient world's most important waterway. The Mediterranean Sea was not simply water. It was the greatest highway the ancient world had ever known. Egypt lay to the south, enormous and powerful. The cities of Mesopotamia and the Levant lay to the east, rich with grain and spices and copper. The islands of the Aegean and the coasts of what would one day become Greece lay to the north. And further west, the Italian peninsula and the coast of North Africa waited beyond the horizon. To sail the Mediterranean was to sail into the very heart of the ancient world. And the Minoans were born right in the center of it all. From the very beginning, the sea was their greatest tool. They built boats to cross wide water. They learned the winds, the currents, and how to navigate by the stars. And they used that knowledge to reach further and further from home. The people of Crete did not waste the gift the earth had given them. From their earliest days, they looked out at the sea and understood its meaning. It was not a barrier. It was not something to fear. It was an open road and a source of tremendous possibility, and they had every intention of traveling it. By around 2,000 years before Christ, the Minoans had built something that no other people in Europe had yet managed to create. They had built a civilization, a real one. Not just a village or a collection of farms, but a full and complex society with cities, palaces, organized trade, and a government powerful enough to hold it all together. The wealth and organization they had built could be felt on every part of the island. At the center of this civilization stood the great palace of Knossos, and it was a wonder unlike anything that had come before it. Knossos was not just a home for a king, it was the beating heart of the entire Minoan world. The palace covered more than 20,000 square meters of ground. It rose several stories into the air. Inside, there were great public rooms where large crowds could gather. There were storage rooms filled with giant clay pots, each one tall enough to hold a grown man, packed with olive oil, grain, and wine. There were workshops where craftsmen made fine pottery, carved ivory, and hammered gold into beautiful jewelry and decorated cups. There were religious rooms where the Minoans honored their gods. And there were private quarters where the most powerful people in the land lived and made decisions that shaped the world of the Eastern Mediterranean. What strikes every person who learns about Knossos is how modern it all feels. The palace had a system of pipes and drainage channels that carried fresh water in and wastewater out. It had light wells, which were open shafts built into the center of the building to let sunlight and fresh air reach the rooms below. It had staircases with smooth stone steps and walls covered in painted plaster. The paintings, which scholars today call frescoes, showed the natural world in vivid detail. Blue monkeys climbed between flowers, dolphins leaped above breaking waves, young people in colorful clothes ran and danced and played. These were not the stiff, formal images of fearful people trying to impress their gods. These were the images of people who loved life, a people who found beauty in the world around them and wanted to capture it. This quality, this celebration of life and nature, set the Minoans apart from nearly every other civilization of their time. Minoan society was also unusual in another very important way. Women were not hidden away or pushed to the edges of public life. The frescoes and the small clay figures found across Crete show women in positions of authority and honor. Women are shown sitting in the front rows at public gatherings. Women are shown as priestesses performing religious ceremonies. Some scholars believe that Minoan religion was led largely by women. Others have suggested that Minoan society may have been one of the most equal between men and women in all of the ancient world. While we cannot be certain of everything, the evidence is clear that Minoan women enjoyed a level of freedom and respect that was extraordinary for their time. At the heart of Minoan religion stood a powerful female figure. Many small statues have been found of a woman holding snakes in both raised hands. Scholars call her the snake goddess. She was most likely a symbol of divine power, a figure who stood between the world of human beings and the world of the gods. The Minoans also worship their gods in outdoor spaces, on hilltops and in caves, places where the earth itself felt sacred and alive. One of the most dramatic parts of Minoan religious life was the practice of bull leaping. Images found across Crete show young men and women running toward a charging bull, grabbing its horns and launching themselves into the air to flip over the animal's back. Whether this was a real athletic event, a religious ritual, or a combination of both, no one is entirely certain. But the images are unmistakable. They show people with courage, a people with speed and skill and absolute confidence in their own bodies. A people who did not fear the wild and powerful forces of the natural world, but engaged with them directly. The Minoans also had music. They had instruments, including harps and flutes and drums. They had feasts and festivals. They had fine clothing made from woven cloth, decorated with patterns and bright colors. Minoan women wore layered skirts that were flounced and colorful. They wore their hair in long, elaborate curls. They wore gold earrings and necklaces of precious stone. Minoan men wore loincloths and sometimes decorated belts of bronze or leather. The people of Crete took pride in how they looked and how they presented themselves to the world. This was not a people living in the shadows of history. This was a person standing at the very front of it. They were building something new, something that the world had not seen before in this part of the earth. And what they were building was growing stronger with every passing generation. New palaces were constructed at other locations on Crete, including at Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. Each one was a center of power and culture in its own right. Each one helped spread the Minoan way of life to every corner of the island. But a civilization cannot grow strong on beauty and religion alone. It needs resources. It needs partners and markets and the raw materials to keep building. The Minoans understood this. And so they looked beyond Crete. They looked at the entire world that surrounded them, and they began to reach out across the water to touch it. By the time the Minoan civilization reached the height of its power, somewhere around 1700 to 1450 years before Christ, it was no longer just a great power on one island. It had become a force that shaped the entire ancient world. Minoan ships sailed to every major port in the eastern Mediterranean. Minoan goods were found in the ruins of cities hundreds of miles from Crete. And in the great palaces of the most powerful rulers of the time, the Minoans were known, respected, and sought after as partners. The heart of Minoan power was trade, not war, not conquest, not armies marching across foreign lands to take what did not belong to them. The Minoans built their greatness on the exchange of goods and the building of relationships. This approach to power was unusual in the ancient world, where most strong nations proved themselves through violence and domination. The Minoans proved themselves through skill, quality, and the ability to deliver what other people wanted. From the forests of Crete, they harvested timber and built ships. These were not small fishing boats. These were large, seaworthy vessels, strong enough to carry heavy cargo across open water and fast enough to outrun bad weather. Minoan sailors knew the sea the way a farmer knows his own land. They could read the color of the water, the direction of the wind, the position of the stars, and the shape of the clouds. They traveled not just across the Aegean Sea, but across the full length of the eastern Mediterranean. To the east, Minoan traders reached the coasts of Syria and what is now Lebanon, the home of the ancient Phoenicians, a people who were themselves becoming famous as skilled sailors and merchants. From these lands, the Minoans brought back cedar wood, which was prized for its strength and its smell, and tin, which when mixed with copper made the strong metal called bronze. Bronze was the most important material in the ancient world. It was used to make tools, weapons, and containers. Any civilization that controlled the supply of bronze held enormous power. To the north and west, Minoan goods reached the Aegean Islands and the mainland of what is now Greece. Minoan pottery, decorated with flowing patterns of octopus and seaweed and waves, has been found in many settlements and trading posts across the wider Aegean world. Wherever Minoan ships landed, Minoan culture followed. But it was the connection to the south, to the great civilization of Egypt, that may have been the most important of all. Egypt, in the second millennium before Christ, was the most powerful nation on earth. Its pharaohs ruled from massive stone palaces. Its armies were the most feared in the world. Its grain fed millions of people. And its hunger for luxury goods, for fine cloth, for precious oils, for beautiful crafted objects, was enormous. The Minoans were among the most important trading partners Egypt ever had. Egyptian records from this period mention a people they called the Keftiu. Scholars today believe the Keftiu were the Minoans. These records describe tall, graceful people arriving by ship with gifts. Egyptian paintings from the great tombs of powerful officials show foreign visitors bringing decorated pottery, copper ingots, and fine vessels. The men in these paintings have narrow waists and long curling hair. They wear decorated loincloths and carry the kind of goods that are unmistakably Minoan. The relationship between the Minoans and Egypt was not a relationship between master and servant. It was a relationship between equals, or something very close to it. The Minoans brought Egypt things it could not easily produce for itself, and Egypt gave the Minoans things they needed in return: gold, ivory, elephant tusks that came from the heart of the African continent, papyrus, the material Egyptians made into a surface for writing, linen cloth, and access to the vast trade networks that Egypt controlled across North Africa and the ancient Near East. Through Egypt, the Minoans were connected to Africa in ways that are rarely discussed in the history books most people have read. The ivory that decorated Minoan palaces came from African elephants. The gold that Minoan craftsmen hammered into fine jewelry may have traveled from mines deep in the African interior before arriving in the workshops of Crete. The Minoans did not know what lay at the heart of Africa, but the products of that great continent passed through their hands and enriched their world. Back home on Crete, the wealth that flowed in from trade filled the great storage rooms of the palaces. The palace of Knossos alone held enough olive oil in its giant storage jars to supply a small city for months. This oil was not just food. It was fuel for lamps, medicine for the body, a substance used in religious ceremonies, and one of the most valuable trade goods in the ancient world. Crete's olive groves covered the hillsides, and the oil they produced was among the finest available anywhere. The Minoans also ran what could be called the first great economic system in European history. The palace was not just a royal home. It was a central hub, collecting goods from the countryside, storing them, and sending them out again. Farmers brought their grain and their oil to the palace. Craftsmen worked in palace workshops. Ships were loaded and unloaded at palace-controlled harbors. The system ran on trust and skill, and it worked. For much of their history, the Minoans did not build strong defensive walls around their cities. They did not need to. The sea protected them. Their navy protected them. And their wealth created a kind of peace that armies alone could not buy. The Minoans had become the most connected people in the ancient world. Their goods and their ideas had spread to every corner of the eastern Mediterranean. They had built something most civilizations could only dream of, but the earth below them was not at peace. About 100 kilometers to the north of Crete, there was another island. It was called Thera. Today, most people know it by the name Santorini. It is a beautiful place. The kind of place that appears on postcards, with its white buildings and blue-domed churches sitting on the edge of a steep cliff above a deep blue bay. But the bay that tourists sail across today is not a natural harbor. It is a hole, a massive, ancient hole left behind by one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. In the time of the Minoans, Thera was a different shape. It was a roughly circular island, and at its center sat a volcano. Not a volcano that looked dangerous, not a great black cone spitting fire and smoke. It was simply a mountain. A mountain that had been quiet for so long that the people who lived on the island had stopped thinking about what it truly was. They had built their city on its slopes and along its shore. They had painted their homes with bright colors and decorated their walls with the most beautiful images in all the ancient world. They had planted their gardens. They had opened their market stalls. They had built a port where ships from Egypt, Crete, and across the Aegean came to buy and sell and rest. The city that sat on Thera was called Akrotiri, and it was extraordinary. Akrotiri was not a small fishing village. It was a full and wealthy urban settlement. Its streets were wide and paved with stone. Its buildings were 2 and 3 stories tall, constructed of carefully cut stone and sun-dried mud brick. Its walls were covered in some of the most beautiful paintings ever produced in the ancient world. One famous painting shows 2 young boys boxing, their fists raised, and their bodies shown with careful attention to muscle and movement. Another shows a fleet of decorated ships sailing between 2 cities, with crowds of people watching from the shore and dolphins leaping through the waves. Another shows a graceful young woman gathering crocus flowers in a wide open field, her dress patterned with rich saffron yellow. These paintings were not decorations for a temple or a palace. They were the everyday art of ordinary people, people who had the time, the wealth, and the desire to make their homes beautiful. Akrotiri was connected to the wider Minoan world by trade and by culture. Its people imported Minoan pottery from Crete. They used Minoan-style weights and measures. They followed Minoan artistic traditions. Whether Akrotiri was a true Minoan colony or an independent community with strong Minoan ties is something historians still debate. But what is clear is that the people of Akrotiri were part of the same broad culture, the same broad world that had its center on Crete. For generations, the people of Thera lived well. The island's soil was naturally fertile, enriched by mineral-rich ash from ancient eruptions in the deep past. The harbor was busy with ships from many different lands. The city grew larger and richer with each passing decade. Merchants from Crete walked its streets. Sailors from Egypt rested in its harbor. Traders from the Aegean islands inspected its goods. Akrotiri was not just a city, it was a meeting point between worlds. The frescoes on the walls show people who were prosperous, healthy, and culturally alive. This was not a people living in fear. This was a people living in full confidence in their future. But somewhere beneath the island, things were changing. Deep inside the earth, far below the homes and streets and flowering gardens of Akrotiri, something massive was stirring. The same volcanic forces that had built the island were now turning against it. Deep, underground, enormous chambers of rock were being pushed apart by superheated gases. Molten rock was rising slowly through cracks in the Earth's crust. Pressure was building in ways that had not been felt for thousands of years. The volcano was not dead. It had never been dead. It had only been sleeping, and now it was beginning to wake. Before the great eruption came, the Earth sent its warnings. The ground began to shake. In the months and possibly years before the final catastrophe, powerful earthquakes rattled the island of Thera again and again. Walls cracked and fell. Buildings shifted on their foundations. Streets buckled and split open. The ground beneath the city moved in ways it had never moved in living memory. Along the coast, the sea began to behave strangely. Water that should have been calm pulled back from the shore without warning, as if the ocean itself was retreating from what was coming. The fish had disappeared from the usual fishing spots for weeks. Animals on the island grew restless and impossible to calm. The people of Akrotiri looked at all of these signs and understood. They had lived near this volcano their entire lives. Their parents and grandparents had lived near it for generations. They knew what a restless earth felt like, and so they made a decision that would, in the end, save every one of their lives. They began to leave. The great evacuation of Akrotiri was one of the most remarkable events of the ancient world. Archaeologists who have spent decades excavating the buried city have found something that still astonishes every scientist who studies it. There are no human remains inside Akrotiri, not a single body, not one set of bones. In most ancient disasters, when a city is buried by volcanic material, the remains of those who did not escape are found. But in Akrotiri, there is nothing. The people took everything they could carry. They took their gold and their jewelry. They took their tools. They packed their most valued possessions, boarded their ships, and sailed away. What they left behind was a ghost city, beautiful, still, and silent, and then the earth cracked open beneath it. No one alive today has ever witnessed a volcanic eruption as large as the one that destroyed Thera. There have been powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Vesuvius, which buried the Roman city of Pompeii in the year 79 after Christ, was devastating to every person caught within its reach. Krakatoa, which erupted in 1,883 inches, what is now Indonesia, was heard 4,000 kilometers away and sent a wave of pressure around the entire Earth twice. Mount Tambora, which erupted in 1815 and threw so much ash and dust into the upper atmosphere that the following year became known across the world as the year without summer, killing crops and causing famine from Europe to America. But the eruption of Thera was larger than all of them. Scientists who have studied the rock and ash and pumice left behind believe the Thera eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in the past 10,000 years. The best estimates suggest it was 4 or more times stronger than Krakatoa. The energy it released equaled many thousands of the most powerful nuclear bombs ever made. It shot a column of fire and gas and ash more than 30 kilometers straight up into the sky. In the moments before the great explosion, the island of Thera was shaking without pause. The ground moved like water. The sea around the coastline pulled back from the shore, exposing the bare ocean floor for hundreds of meters, as if the water itself was fleeing from what was about to happen. Sea creatures lay gasping and dying in the exposed mud. Birds lifted from every surface and flew away together in great panicking flocks. And then it happened. The volcano did not simply erupt, it exploded. The entire upper portion of the mountain was destroyed in an instant, blown outward in every direction in a blast of fire and gas and rock. A column of superheated material rose into the sky at unimaginable speed. The sound traveled across hundreds of kilometers of open water in every direction. People standing on the shores of Egypt, hundreds of kilometers to the south, would have felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. People in the cities of what is now Israel and Lebanon would have heard a sound so enormous it seemed to have no natural explanation, a sound that would have shaken them to their deepest core. Then the column collapsed. When a volcanic column of this size collapses, it does not simply fall down and stop. It becomes what scientists call pyroclastic flows. These are rivers of superheated gas and shattered rock and ash that pour down the sides of a volcano at hundreds of kilometers per hour. They burn and bury everything they touch. Within minutes of the column's collapse, the city of Akrotiri, already empty of its people, was buried under tens of meters of volcanic material. The paved streets disappeared. The painted walls disappeared. The stone buildings were crushed and buried as if they had never existed. A city that had stood and lived and breathed for centuries was gone in the time it takes to draw a breath. But the eruption did not stop at Thera. The volcano had blown out so much material from so deep inside the earth that the ground beneath the island could no longer hold itself up. The center of Thera collapsed inward. The caldera, the hollow chamber beneath the mountain, filled with seawater in a matter of minutes as the land above it fell away. And the violent collision of hot volcanic material and cold seawater generated something even more terrifying than everything that had come before it. A tsunami. Not one wave, but a series of enormous walls of water radiating outward from the collapsed island in every direction at the speed of a commercial airplane. These walls of water had no warning sound. They gave no advance signal as they crossed the open sea. They simply moved, relentless and invisible, until they approached shallow water. Then they rose. Then they struck. The northern coast of Crete was less than 100 kilometers from Thera. The Minoan harbors and coastal settlements there had been built over centuries. They were the economic arteries of the entire civilization. The ships that loaded and unloaded there carried the lifeblood of the Minoan economy. When the tsunamis reached those shores, the water surged inland with a force that no stone wall could resist. Ships were picked up and driven onto land and shattered against buildings and cliffs. Warehouses packed full of olive oil, bronze, and grain were swept entirely into the sea. Harbor walls that had stood for generations were torn apart in seconds as if they were made of dry sand. The docks vanished. The loading platforms vanished. The entire commercial infrastructure of the Minoan civilization, the harbors, the warehouses, the trading posts, was gone in the time it took to breathe. The ash cloud, meanwhile, continued to spread. A thick, suffocating blanket of fine grey particles settled across Crete and the surrounding islands. On Crete itself, ash fell on the fields and the crops. Plants starved of sunlight stopped growing and wilted where they stood. Animals that ate the ash-contaminated grass fell sick and died. Water stored in open containers became grey and undrinkable. The sky remained pale and dim for months, perhaps longer. Farmers who had counted on the harvest to feed their families through the winter had nothing to harvest. The storage rooms in the palaces, once so full, could not be restocked at the speed that was needed. The trade routes that had kept the Minoan world alive were severed. Ships could not sail through the thick fields of floating pumice that covered the sea around Thera for months after the eruption. The markets that had linked Crete to Egypt, to the Levant, to the Aegean islands fell silent. A civilization built entirely on connection was suddenly, completely, and terrifyingly alone. The Minoans, who survived the catastrophe, found themselves standing at the edge of a world that no longer looked the way it had. Their harbors were gone, their ships were damaged or lost. Their coastal settlements were in ruins, the crops were failing, the trade routes were broken. And the people who had built one of the most advanced civilizations the ancient world had ever seen had no way of knowing whether what they were living through was a temporary disaster or the permanent end of their world. For a time, the great palace of Knossos still stood. The Minoans did not collapse immediately after the eruption of Thera. The disaster weakened them deeply, but it did not finish them in a single blow. They began to rebuild. They cleared ash from their fields. They repaired what could be repaired. They tried to reopen the trade routes that their economy depended on, but the damage went too deep. The destruction of the coastal harbors was not simply a physical problem. It was an economic catastrophe. The Minoan system depended on the constant movement of goods. Olive oil moved out, copper and tin moved in. Everything was connected. When the harbors were destroyed and the ships were lost and the routes were broken, the entire system began to collapse. The great storage rooms of the palaces, once so full they could feed cities, began to empty. And then the Mycenaeans came. The Mycenaeans were a people from the mainland of what is now Greece. They had long admired the Minoans. They had traded with them and learned from them. They had adopted Minoan art styles, Minoan building techniques, and a version of Minoan writing which scholars call Linear B, a script that, unlike Linear A, has been successfully decoded. The Mycenaeans were not strangers to Minoan culture, but they were also aggressive and militaristic in ways that the Minoans were not. Around 1,450 years before Christ, about 1 or 2 generations after the eruption of Thera, evidence in the archaeological record shows that Crete changed hands. The palace of Knossos was taken over by Mycenaean rulers. The clay tablets found at Knossos are written in the Mycenaean script, not the Minoan one. The palace continued to function, but it was now a Mycenaean palace. The culture that had built this extraordinary civilization was being absorbed and replaced by people who had learned from it but were not of it. Within a few more generations, the palace of Knossos itself was destroyed. Around 1380 to 1350 years before Christ, a great fire consumed the palace. Whether it was a rebellion, an accident, or an attack from outside is still debated, but the result is clear. The great palace of Knossos burned to the ground, and the Minoan civilization did not recover. There is one final thing that must be said about the Minoans, one last mystery that ties their story to one of the most famous legends in all of history. Around 360 years before Christ, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote about a civilization called Atlantis. He described it as a powerful island nation that had been destroyed in a single day and night by a great catastrophe. It had advanced ships, it had great buildings, it had a culture of extraordinary refinement. And then it was swallowed by the earth and was gone forever.